Was it the story of the second chance or even the last chance? Because that's what the colonies were. They were this was, the last chance saloon, really.
Well, I think it's all those things. The first sermon, the first time you get public preaching on a piece of the Bible in Australia, Richard Johnson, the chaplain, chose a verse from Psalm 116, which was about what can I render to God for all his benefits to me. It's a verse of thankfulness. Why on earth would a convict, why would he think to encourage them to thankfulness when they've just landed on the other side of the world where they will spend the rest of their foreseeable lives, often in separation from their families, all those things? And I think because it's the alternative to a death sentence, that there is a second, it's literally a second chance. And there's actually a wonderful story of a prayer book that was found inside, believe this or not, this history's wonderful, inside a shark that was hauled on to one of the ships of the First Fleet when it was sailing back to England. They were fishing off the side of the boat near Norfolk Island. They hauled in a shark, slid it open and found a prayer book inside, not a leaf of it defaced, according to one of the lieutenants. And inside was inscribed, given to Francis McCarthy, a convict, to mark the occasion of being reprieved and transported, not sentenced to death. So that idea of a second chance is foundational to the whole idea of penal settlement as opposed to death sentences. So, of course, but is this a land of exile? Is this a promised land of new beginnings? All those biblical narratives are used by Europeans to try and make sense of this enormous experience of colonising a new place.
Let's talk, Meredith, about the way you deal with the book, The Bible in Australia, A Cultural History, and its ambiguous relationship with Indigenous Australians. My friend and colleague Stan Grant talks very affectionately about his grandfather and his great-grandfather, I think, who were both Aboriginal pastors. But at the same time, you point out in this book that the Bible never took hold of Indigenous Australia in the way that it did, for example, with the Maori people in New Zealand or South Pacific Islanders. So what was the relationship between the Bible and the first Australians?
Well, the history of Christianity in Indigenous societies, as you say, is very different to a lot of other. Other places in the South Pacific, and I'm not sure historians have really cracked that or got right to the bottom of that yet. There are significant cultural differences, I think, that might have something to do with the different reception of the scriptures. But the Bible came with Europeans who set about colonising
King. Now, Martin Luther King was unquestionably a Christian minister. He also developed, though,
years ago. And he said, in his words, as an educated black, who can read the Bible? This is not...
Story, because even though you say that biblical literacy in Australia is probably at its lowest point since colonisation, there are some extraordinary moments, if you like, of public witness, and one I think that affected Australians profoundly. It certainly affected me, and we did a number of stories on it, is the story of Andrew Chan, who was one of the leaders of the Bali Nine. Tell me about his very public witness and therefore his biblical literacy.
He didn't really even know what a Bible was until he was in prison facing the end of his life in that very stressful scenario. And he picked up a Bible not knowing that there was an Old Testament and a New Testament, but looking for something, thinking that if my life's going to end, I need to work out what's going to happen next. Am I going to heaven or hell? So I'd better pray. I don't know how to. And being guided by a visitor to, why don't you have a look in the Bible? And over a long time, actually, at first not making any sense of it, it not seeming relevant at all, over a few reads, especially of the Gospels, finding something remarkable, hearing a voice from God by his own account, that God did speak, and converting to a very vibrant and deep form of Pentecostal Christianity, undertaking theological education, becoming a pastor, leading reform programs, including religious services in Caribbean prison, and going to his death singing hymns, including Amazing Grace. It's a complete revolution of his life from a personal reading of the Bible, which I think is quite uncommon now. But at the same time, what appealed to him was that intensely personal transformation that was on offer as he saw it. And I think the community of the Pentecostal churches and that particular kind of spirituality, I think he found very empowering.
I mean, Andrew Chan and Maya and Sukumaran, they had some help along the way. Two quite extraordinary couples, Rob and Christy Buckingham from Bayside Church in Melbourne, and the Soapers, who were a Salvation Army couple. You mentioned their final moments. They didn't just sing Amazing Grace themselves. They were with a whole group of others. I mean, had Andrew Chan become, in a sense, an exemplar? of what the Bible's supposed to represent. I mean, this was a very fallen man, and he would be the first to acknowledge that.
He did acknowledge that. I think that that's still one of the main ways that the Bible matters in Australia today, is as a text that guides people to that kind of relationship with God, if you like, one that involves the forgiveness of whatever their past might be and the opportunity of something different, something new, a kind of salvation through Christ. That's definitely one of the most important ways that the Bible still matters. I mean, 8% of Australians, more people than in all of South Australia, still go to church on a Sunday. And for a lot of them, that's a crucial dynamic. And I think one of the reasons that it's still a text that is worth knowing something about and paying attention to. But that said, fascinating about the Bible is it has an influence in our culture that goes beyond the life of faith. The legacies of colonialism, as we've discussed, in our wider culture, in the arts, it's stimulus to the imagination and to creativity, as we've seen with like Nick Cave and Helen Garner and people like that, that even aside from personal faith, it seems, from what I've seen in history, to be a text that rewards attention and rewards reflection, and is that the dynamic of grappling with it has been a dynamic in our history that is ongoing.
Thanks so much for being with us, because it's wonderful to talk to you. Meredith Lake's book is The Bible in Australia, A Cultural History. Thanks for sharing it with us on the Religion and Ethics Report and with the folks here at Glee Books in Sydney. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, the floor is open.
Thank you, Meredith and Andrew. We're a very multicultural nation. Can you give us an insight into how different ethnic groups have engaged with the Bible?
I think that's one of the most significant things that has happened, particularly since the Second World War. For much of Australians, like post-colonisation history, the Bible's been an artefact of Englishness and really bound up with English language, culture, society, institutions. But as a lot of those churches have declined in their proportional adherence, the rise of churches associated with other groups and cultures has really opened out what the Bible is, how it's read, what translation it's read in, and what it might mean. And I think for a lot of communities, when they've arrived from somewhere else, the church and the religious life of that community is often one of the things that really glues that community together in a new environment. And so often the reading of scripture liturgically, it has a potency in especially first generation migrant communities that's really important. And I think one of the reasons, again, why Bible literacy is useful now is to actually, if we heard better the voices of relatively recent immigrants, many of whom are Christian, we might get a more diverse Christian conversation in public. That would be worth investing in and being open to, I think.
Next week on RN Summer, we revisit one of the most profound and moving events of 2018, the 50th anniversary of the martyrdom of Dr. Martin Luther King. Thanks to Muna Tadias and Wayne Ewan, I'm Andrew West, and I'm back next week.
Why do you listen to Global Community Radio? Do you listen to stay informed? Do you listen to discover new music? Do you have questions, comments, or criticisms about the station's programming? How do you listen to GCR programming, online or through a local rebroadcaster? We want to hear from you. Your feedback as a listener is very important to us. Send email to globalcommunityradio@gmail.com. That's globalcommunityradio@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you.